Hello and welcome to the Jazz Jam Podcast. I'm your host, Dwayne Gunnels, joined by my co-host, Max Levy. On today's episode 9, we're going to be getting into the classic album by Dizzy Gillespie, Sonny Stitt, and Sonny Rollins entitled Sunny Side Up. And so before we get into the album itself, I want to start out with our jazz question of the week. First of all, Max, how are you doing? And second of all, the question I have for you is, how are you able to tell which saxophone player is playing during their solos on the album, and what contributes to each of their individual styles? Because I know even for me, and definitely probably for some of our listeners, it can probably be hard to tell whether it's Sonny Stitt or Sonny Rollins playing on the album. So how do you tell between the two of them, Max?
Well, as a saxophone player, it's, I don't know, maybe ingrained in me a little bit more, or I just intuitively can tell the differences in their individual sounds and styles just a little bit easier, I think, than maybe people who play other instruments or other listeners that are more or less into the jazz tradition. So there's a lot that can contribute to a person's sound. One is the tone that they make as a player, which is influenced by the shape of their own mouth and the way that they are positioning their lips and their tongue while the mouthpiece, the saxophone mouthpiece, is actually physically in their mouth. So we call that the embouchure. So there's a lot of different ways to make an embouchure. There's kind of one general way to do it for saxophone, and then there are certain differences amongst players about how they approach their own embouchure. So sometimes players have their bottom lip out further or in further in terms of going out towards the saxophone, or if it's in closer to them, towards themselves in their own mouth. And so what that does, that can soften the tone, or that can darken the tone that the individual is making on the instrument. So just try to listen for the differences in the overall sound. It seems like Sonny Stitt, his tone is just a little warmer and mellower. And you can tell that on this album, versus Sonny Rollins, who has just a slightly, I don't know, deeper or heftier sound that's more reminiscent to a player like Coleman Hawkins. And if you don't know, in the history of if you look up, the influences of Sonny Rollins and where his sound kind of comes from, he's kind of known for mixing both Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins in his approach. And also, of course, the bebop licks and ideas that people like Bird, Charlie Parker, really, solidified and played all the time. That's part of Sonny Rollins's language on the horn, but his sound is kind of more like a Coleman Hawkins. And so you can just, if you just try to listen to their individual tones, you can really tell those differences. Also, other things to listen for is how they articulate, which is how they approach certain notes. Do they play certain notes shorter or longer, or how do they end their phrases or begin their phrases, is another way to tell the difference between them. And all the go-to sort of improvisational ideas, it seems like if you listen and you really check out what Sonny Stitt is doing, a lot of his stuff is kind of, there's a lot of diminished licks he pulls from. And there's just some really go-to bebop-oriented ideas that he verbatim plays and pulls from in his playing when he's soloing, whereas Sonny Rollins seems to be just slightly more playful and is known for really developing as he goes. He'll lay an idea and then he'll add to that idea and change it in a number of different ways within the same, 4 or 8 bars of whatever that initial idea was. So just their approaches and their improvisations is different, their tone is different, and their style, their articulations are different.
Yeah, Max, I think that's a really good and comprehensive answer, and just the best way to be able to tell saxophone players apart, and really players in jazz of any instrument is to listen and to listen to them a lot, and you'll be able to pick up on and listen for the things that Max is talking about. Listen for their tone, their articulation, the way that they like to play, and the licks they like to use. And over time, you'll be able to hear a saxophone player, like with me, especially for pianists and definitely some saxophone players. I can just hear, and instantly I'm just like, okay, that's Oscar Peterson. I can tell by the style in which he's playing. And it's just because I've listened to so many hundreds of hours of Oscar Peterson playing that you get so familiar with their technique that, I had to ask Max. I was like, Max, can you make me a roadmap of who's playing on this album just so I don't mess it up? I was like, because I've listened to these guys, but not enough. And Max was like, oh, are you serious? And for Max, it's no question. He can tell them apart so easily. But for me, I'm like, yeah, I don't want to get it wrong. Like, I don't want to be thinking I'm listening to one of the guys and be listening to the other, just because I'm not really familiar enough to be 100% certain of which one's which.
Absolutely, and that's mainly because number one, as I mentioned, I'm a saxophone player, so I maybe it's a little easier for me to tell because it's what I've been listening to and been trying to copy and emulate, and I've transcribed a bunch of Sonny Rollins, so I've tried to imitate his sound. Or another guy I really like is Gene Ammons. I've tried to imitate his style and sound, or just different guys I listen to, some Johnny Griffin. And so if you do that enough with one player, I know a guy in town, he's a friend of mine, and one of his main guys is Sonny Stitt. So he's transcribed a whole bunch of Sonny Stitt. And so if you do that and you learn their solos, you get into their approaches, the sound, their improvisations, their range on the horn, what is an idea that they constantly use in multiple different situations, musically or harmonically or melodically. What is their way of playing? Because a really key thing about jazz musicians is that they're going to have an individual style that can be traced by their own influences and what those influences did in their playing.
Yeah, and I kind of equate it to almost listening, like when we hear our friends talk and we can recognize their voice. Like, I've heard Max talk enough to where I recognize it's Max by what he's saying, his inflection. And it's kind of similar to when you listen to a certain player enough, when you listen to enough Coltrane's pretty easy because he's got such a unique sound. But when you listen to enough Gene Ammons, you instantly, it's almost like hearing your friend's voice. You can just hear, like, you understand what they're saying because you've heard it so often. It's really familiar. So I think what Max is saying there is, yeah, when you listen to one guy and you can transcribe some of his solos and things like that, it's almost just like hearing them talk to you through their instrument. So you're able to pick up on it that quickly. So yeah, it's a great point, and that's you really filled out like all the different ways to be able to tell different people apart. So that was a really good answer, Max. Let's get into the history on this album. There's not a lot to talk about the history, but there is one important thing to note. But more importantly, we'll get into the personnel and talk about the people on the album a little bit before getting into the breakdown. So the history, it was recorded, we said Dizzy Gillespie, Sonny Stitt, Sonny Rollins, recorded in December of 1957 in New York City, and it was released 2 years later in 1959. And what's pretty much, I think, most important about it is that it was on the newly launched Verve label, which has become very well known, and many cats have played on the Verve label. So this was, came out when that label was pretty new, which I think is significant.
Yeah, that label was started by a guy named Norman Granz, who, if you don't know the history of Norman Granz and his place in this music, you really should check him out and check out what he's done. He was very influential in a lot of different aspects of the recording of jazz music and also putting on concerts. So he was the guy that ran all the Jazz at the Philharmonic series concerts, which, if you don't know what those are, he started that in 1944, right around there, and he used a lot of just really heavy swing guys. I know Illinois Jacquet, Flip Phillips. Later, he would do a lot with Oscar Peterson and Ben Webster, Benny Carter, and just a bunch of guys that are just really swing oriented and can put on a real show. So he was very influential in desegregating musical audiences at a concert. So he was, with his Jazz at the Philharmonic series, he kind of was the first very, very mainstream in a, big concert hall setting to desegregate um, the listener audience for a concert. And that was, the mid 40s. So he's influential not only in the music realm, but also in the overall historical, um, you know, our classic American issues of racism and going through, the racial strife and the civil rights movement. He was an initial player in that way. So really look up Norman Granz and the history of the Verve record label, because there's so much there to learn and gather from.
Yeah, I think it's definitely really important. And one thing we want to do on this show is to highlight some of the important history in jazz, and we wouldn't be doing a great job if we didn't talk about the people who weren't players, people on record labels, and people who are promoters and such things such as that, producers. If we didn't talk about Rudy Van Gelder, we wouldn't be doing a good job, and the guys like Norman
Right.
Granz. So I think it's really important. I think Max brings up some great points. The desegregation at a time before the civil rights movement, when,
Right.
audience were so segregated. So, and jazz is something that obviously can bring people together. It's a very eclectic mix of musicians from different backgrounds, and that's one thing that I love about jazz. But let's get into the personnel on the album. I'm going to let Max talk about the horn players on the album, and then I'll get into the rhythm section. So Max, why don't you take us away with the horn players?
Absolutely. There's so much I could talk about with each of these guys. I mean, there are whole books written on them. So I won't mention everything, and there's some stuff I'm going to have to leave out, but I'm going to just give a general brief overview of these players and everything they've done. Of course, first we have the Dizzy Gillespie, trumpet player, composer, and also singer, and he does sing on one of the tracks on this album. And he's really well known as just an overall band leader, and he's had just so much influence in this music. He was originally born in South Carolina in the year 1917. His father was a band leader. So a lot of these guys were just initially born into a musical family. And you'll notice that with each of these players I'm going to mention, um, that Dizzy, because he was surrounded by the music, he started on the piano at 4 years old, and he just really was digging into the music, and he taught himself trombone and then later trumpet. And he always dreamed of becoming a jazz man after hearing the great swing player Roy Eldridge, who is another very influential trumpet player and who had a lot of just overall influence on Dizzy and his playing. So as Dizzy started listening and playing more, he was gigging starting in the 1935, and he later played with Cab Calloway in 1939. But Dizzy was playing too many notes for Cab Calloway, and Dizzy is really one of the bebop kind of incubators, and so he was fired from Cab Calloway's band in 1941. Cab just disliked the bebop way of playing. And so he said, Dizzy, you're doing too many notes. And I think also they got into a fight. So something happened. They didn't get along, and he was fired from that band. Later on, he played with Earl Hines, which we mentioned in Satchmo of Pasadena, how a lot of bebop guys played with swing era players, and especially with Earl Hines. He then went on and joined Billy Eckstine's band. We've also mentioned that one. Another kind of go-to for a lot of modern bebop players at the time. And through those experiences, he really became known as a bop player. And he was performing with Bird in 44 to 45. And then later he had his own big band by 1947. And that's kind of where he grew as a band leader. And he had hits like Manteca and Tintindio, which was also influenced by Afro-Cuban music. And so you'll notice a lot of that approach is mixing of styles, and Dizzy loved the Afro-Cuban thing, so he often pulled from that as a composer. And along the way, if you know Dizzy, his trumpet bell is bent upwards, and he has big puffy cheeks when he plays. And so that happened because at a party, somehow his bell on a regular, normal looking trumpet was bent upwards. But he tested it. He played the trumpet anyway. He liked the sound, and it just seemed to project a little bit easier. And so he just kept it, and he had horns that were especially made for him to have that bent in them. And so that became Dizzy's thing. Later on, he continued to play, toured the world. He led the United Nations Orchestra in the 1980s. He also was a soloist with Stevie Wonder. And then in the early 90s, he developed pancreatic cancer, and he had to stop playing right around 1992. And in 93, he passed away due to cancer. He had a very, very interesting life and also personal life. He is one of the few jazz greats to be married to the same woman for a very long time. He was married to Lorraine Willis for 53 years. And also, he was a little politically active. He had promoted himself in the 1964 general election for president as a write-in candidate. So he just also had very interesting religious ideas, and he just was an all-around very, worldly cat, and interesting player, and interesting person. So feel free to check out. There's so much more to talk about with Dizzy Gillespie.
Yeah, I think he's just one of the most influential players and trumpet players. And one thing I want to point out, just an interesting fact, is the bent bell. Christian Scott Tunde also, uses the same kind of trumpet. So it's cool to see modern cats kind of taking from things and something that happened by accident. So I think that's just a cool story about how that happened with him at that party.
Yeah, it's one of those things, that's defines what Dizzy is all about, and his approach and his style, and it's part of the music, so it's good to know those things. And then really, to me, the two that shine on this album are Sonny Stitt and Sonny Rollins, the sax players. And so if you don't know, Sonny Stitt is known for playing both the alto and the tenor sax. If you want to check out some of the best alto sax jazz playing, listen to Sonny Stitt Sits In with the Oscar Peterson Trio. That's a great record, and that's a great representation of what he can do on alto. And then I think on this album, this is a great representation of what he can do on tenor. So he's a player to really get into. Sonny Stitt, born in Boston in 1924. His dad, a college music professor. So again, born into that initially musical family, but he was adopted, and that's where his last name comes from, is from his adoption, because the adoptive family's name was Stitt. Originally, he was named Edward Boatner Jr., Edward Hammond Boatner Jr. So a little interesting there. As he grew up, he was playing in local swing bands in Michigan. He eventually met Bird in 1943, and apparently they both recognized that they both sounded very similar. And so the cliche with Sonny Stitt is that his alto playing sounds a lot like Charlie Parker, and he's basically just kind of copying Charlie Parker. But if you actually transcribe what he's doing and listen to a lot of Stitt on alto, that's not really true. If you dig in and really listen to what he's doing, you can initially, generally say that they're both very similar on the alto sax, and they have the same, really bop heavy approach. But if you dig in, it's kind of insulting to Sonny Stitt to say he's just a Bird clone, because it's not exactly true. But that's kind of the reputation he got. And so because of that, he started adding in the tenor sax into his playing. And on the tenor saxophone, he had a more unique sound. So a lot of times he stuck with that in different settings. He would go on to join Dizzy's big band, and around that time started playing a lot more tenor. He had a group with Gene Ammons where they had dueling, tenor saxes from 50 to 52. And then in the 60s they would do that again, and then they would tour and record again in the 70s. So some of the best Sonny Stitt playing is on his records, where it's him and Gene Ammons both on tenor. He was also a part of the Miles Davis quintet in 1960, but for a very short period of time. Miles was kind of changing his direction musically, and Stitt just really wasn't matching what Miles Davis wanted to do. So he was only briefly with Miles, and he continued to play and record into the 70s until his death in 1982 from cancer. And he had a lot of issues with alcoholism, and so that's eventually what led to his death.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've talked about this before, but a lot of jazz musicians who have those vices and died of cancer or certain things, lung cancer, we talk about a lot. So yeah, it's unfortunate to see guys in that era that had those issues.
Yeah, you'll notice there's bouts of alcoholism, a lot of issues with heroin and drugs, and a lot of substance abuse, and that's for a number of reasons. But you'll notice that in this period of jazz, especially.
Yeah. So Max, why don't you tell us about Sonny Rollins?
Yeah, the other Sonny on the album. He was a player on tenor sax from the get-go. He's widely recognized as one of the most influential jazz musicians. He's recorded over 60 albums as a leader. He was born in 1930. And for those who don't know, he is still alive. He's not really playing anymore, but he's still around to this day. And his music has been so influential to not only saxophone players but to the world in general. So if you don't know him, please check him out. Again, born in 1930 in New York City, he got his first saxophone by the age of 8. And later on in high school, he played in a band with a lot of jazz greats, including Jackie McLean, Art Taylor. He was influenced by guys like Louis Jordan, Perez, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, Illinois Jacquet. And so listening to those records, and as he did, and I think he did a little transcribing, you can tell from his playing later on that those foundations are always present in everything that he's doing. And then right around 1949 is when he started recording and hitting the scene as a professional. And so he was only, I think, 19 years old, maybe 18 years old. So by 18, he already had a lot of things together. And so he was recording with Babs Gonzalez in 49, appeared with guys like Bud Powell in the early 50s. He recorded with Miles Davis for a little bit in the mid 50s. And his classic compositions, Oleo and Doxy, are from those recordings he did with Miles. And, we mentioned the vices that guys would have. And Sonny Rollins early on was addicted to heroin, but fortunately he broke his heroin habit in 1955 and really became a clean cat. He began releasing his own albums in 56 with the great album Saxophone Colossus. If you don't know that record, please check it out. We'll probably go over it at some time in the future. He constantly worked on his sound and approach, and he was always developing what he was doing. So there were at least 2 periods where he took a musical sabbatical. And during those 2-year sabbaticals, that what he would do is he would really just shed and practice and really get into his style and change what he's doing. And he was always interested in progressing and being, changing up his artistry in a lot of different ways. There's one before the album, The Bridge, where before that album, The Bridge, he literally practiced underneath a bridge in New York City. I think it's called the Washington Bridge. For like a year and a half, he would just practice under the bridge because he liked the sound that he would get acoustically, and just playing outdoors, I guess, made him expand what he was doing on the instrument.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it just shows you how dedicated to some like some of these guys are to developing their sound, even 20 years into their career. They're still wanting to find new ways to develop their sound. They're not just sticking to the things that they know. So I think that's interesting. And yeah, we see it's unfortunate because we see guys who have different breaks in their careers for different reasons, whether it be heroin addictions. This is for a good reason, the sabbatical to practice. But we talk about Dexter Gordon in a previous episode and his 10-year, nearly decade-long sabbatical due to some I think heroin addiction as well with Dexter.
Yeah, it was, I believe so. And right, this is for a really good musical reason. And fortunately, Sonny Rollins was able to kick his heroin habit pretty early on.
Yeah.
And so everything else is just really golden and authentic and, very musical. And Sonny Rollins is also kind of spiritual in a lot of, in his, kind of overall approach. So I think for those reasons, it's really cool to see, the trajectory and the history of Sonny Rollins. And it's all recorded, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Because we can check out and hear those differences for ourselves. And that's a lesson in itself. That's a great thing about a lot of this music we call jazz, is that it is recorded and it's always approachable, and we can reference it for anything else that we're doing.
Yeah, and jazz, different than like some other genres, guys have such large discographies. They record so many albums, especially back in these days, that you can really hear, guys throughout the years, which is cool to be able to hear so many different examples of Sonny Rollins playing. One thing you said, he's spiritual, and I just wanted to say that to play under a bridge for a year and a half, I think you'd have to be at least a little bit spiritual to go through doing that. So
I think you're right. Yeah.
So I'm going to get into the rhythm section just briefly. There's definitely stuff to be talked about, but I feel like we're going to have these guys back on the podcast later because they're all really influential cats and played a lot with guys in the era. So I'll just give you the cliff notes now, and if we have them on again, we can go in a little bit deeper. So firstly, we have Ray Bryant on the piano, and he was a pianist, but also a composer and an arranger. And he was born in Philadelphia, and like many other jazz musicians, his parents were musicians, played the piano, and he also had musical brothers. We'll get into one very soon. He started gigging when he was age 12, and he was snuck into bars in Philadelphia to play when he was 12 years old. And he had a lot of different musical influences, including gospel music, and he kind of morphs his career later, and so we'll talk about that. But yeah, he began playing in the church and he actually became the house pianist at the Blue Note Club in Philadelphia, which is pretty cool. And then he recorded for Prestige Records, played with Art Taylor, Coleman Hawkins, Carmen Ray, and Art Blakey, and he formed his own trio in 1960. And he also recorded with Aretha Franklin, and that's what I was talking about earlier. He had a bit of an R&B crossover success, so he played with Aretha Franklin for a while. And so yeah, and he died in 2011. So
he was also kind of popular overseas. I know he toured Europe and Japan quite often. So he was kind of well known overseas as well. And he kind of had a long career and a long life. And I just want to mention, you mentioned at age 12, he was gigging. He was making money to be snuck into bars and to play for groups at age 12. So if you're doing it then, you have a future in it as you keep going.
That's such a Philly thing to do, have a 12-year-old like sneak him in the back door of the bar to play the piano. So yeah, so let's get into Tommy Bryant, who is on bass and is Ray Bryant's brother. So he was also born in Philly, and he started playing bass at the age of 12, and he played with some local bands, but then he served in the military in Korea and then began touring and performing again in 1956. He played with Papa Joe Jones, Charlie Shavers, Roy Eldridge, Benny Golson, and also the Ink Spots. And he also recorded with Mahalia Jackson, who is a really prominent gospel singer.
Yeah, you'll see his name in a couple of different random places like that. But I think he was with the Ink Spots for a long time, something like 15 years almost. So um, he had a lot of interesting connections there with Tommy Bryant and the Bryant brothers in general. So
Is is Bobby Bryant, is he related to them? The trumpet player? I don't know if he's the same age.
I don't think so.
Okay, because that's another Bryant. I'll get into. You can look that up while I talk about the drummer. Who the drummer is Charlie Persip, and he was born in New Jersey in 1929, and he was playing drums by high school. He performed with Tad Dameron, the pianist, toured with Dizzy's big band in the mid 50s, and by the 1960s, he had recorded with Lee Morgan, which he recorded with Lee Morgan a good amount, and he played on the album Pecking Time with Lee Morgan, which is a really popular album. He played with Zoot Sims, Red Garland, Gene Ammons, Dina Washington, and he began teaching in the mid-1970s in New York and led his own big band in the 1980s. And he kept teaching and playing even into the 2000s, and he just recently passed away in 2020 at the age of 91. So he lived a really long life. He has a really large discography, played with lots of guys in so many albums he was on throughout the 50s and the 60s. So just a really massive discography.
Yeah, you will find his name in a lot of places too. Drummers get around and they play with everybody.
Yeah.
I don't know if Bobby Bryant was related. I don't think so.
Okay.
I'm going to try and confirm that as we keep going.
Yeah, I don't know where Bobby was from, and just the Bryant last name. I didn't know if there was any chance he was related. But
this is saying Bobby Bryant was born in Mississippi.
Oh, okay, then probably
in
not.
The 30s. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think so.
I knew he was around the same age and with the same last name, so I didn't know if there was any chance that.
Well, I don't know. We'll have to confirm at a later date.
Yeah. We'll hold on to that one, and we'll do some more researching. But all right, well, let's get into the actual album breakdown now, and let's get into the first track on the album. Max, why don't you tell us a little bit about the tune, the history of "On the Sunny Side of the Street"?
Yeah, it's a classic standard you'll hear cats play. Originally written by Jimmy McHugh, which we've mentioned before. He's kind of one of the most prolific songwriters of the 1920s through the 1950s. He's written over 500 songs. Other songs he's known for are Exactly Like You. So he's just all over the Great American Songbook. I did see a thing where it was a little bit disputed. Some people think or they say that Fats Waller actually wrote On the Sunny Side of the Street, and he sold the rights to the song to Jimmy McHugh or his company or what have you. So I don't know. I couldn't figure out if I could confirm that or not, but I've seen that in association with the history of this song.
Yeah, it does sound like something that you maybe could attribute to something that sounds like Fats Waller would have written, like an Ain't Misbehaving, a similar kind of tune. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to confirm it, but that's an interesting little tidbit about the history of the writing of the tune.
Yeah, and it's just, you can do so much with that song, and it's just one of those classic hits that I think will always forever be used and referenced in the repertoire, and it's also something that will forever, or at least almost forever, be recognizable to play on a gig. So it's kind of happy too. So people dig it. People want to hear this tune more than you would think. And this is a really cool version that's on Sunny Side Up. Because of Dizzy Gillespie, I think there's a lot of really neat arranging on this album. And by this time, he had his big band together for about 10 years. And, I would assume he arranged a lot for his big band and was great at putting harmonies together amongst different horn sections and different horns. So I think that comes from Dizzy on this album, or at least his influence. Yeah. What do you think, Dwayne?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that especially this track, it almost kind of feels like a big band arrangement of the song, but it's played with just a few horn play, in a smaller ensemble. And we'll get into why, but I think the way they play over the bridge and the melody is really reminiscent of a big band arrangement.
Absolutely. You can tell that right from the beginning of the track because they start out with this kind of ominous chord that sounds similar to the start of a big band arrangement. And it's kind of a gotcha moment to me when the head comes in at the 6-second mark because there's a long, drawn out crescendo from the horns, and you think they're going to go into, I don't know, some sort of really, really big, sort of almost symphonic type sound, or intricate big band arrangement. But no, they just start the tune kind of out of nowhere at that 6-second mark. And as they start that sort of, I think it's that start that crescendo into the head, it kind of sounds like one of the Sonnies starts that hit of the note just a little bit sooner than the other two players. And, it's interesting to hear little things like that. Are the horns together throughout the whole thing, or do they start off differently, or what happens with each player's treatment of their part in the arrangement?
Yeah, for sure. And I like the way that they play the melody all together over the A sections, and kind of what we were talking about is there's this really unique call and response on the bridge. I just think that that's such a unique way to play the bridge that this version of the song really sticks out in my mind. When I think about this song, that's often one of the ways I think about this bridge is that call and response style that they do on the bridge.
Absolutely. If you don't know, it's an AABA tune, 32 bar form. It's a nice swing and tempo most of the time, and they do that here. But you're right, the head is pretty unison. But that's harder to do than you would think, especially if you have, an instrument in there that's different from the other two. So you got two saxes and a trumpet, and you have to be really good at blending and listening to one another and playing as a section. And they do that pretty well here. Sometimes if you get that from jazz musicians, at least jazz musicians who haven't played together a whole bunch, they may not pull it off as well.
Yeah, I definitely think it can be harder for guys to do than you might think, because one thing that a lot of guys like to do is they like to kind of play the melody their own way, and the melody might say one thing on paper, the way it's written, but a lot of guys will take a melody and they might not play it exactly the way it's written on the paper. So you gotta, you really gotta be listening and blending well, like Max said, and you all have to play the melody together in the same way to really achieve this kind of unison, which is nice because they're really together on this. So
that's right. And that call and response between the saxes and Dizzy, that's not a part of the melody, but they make it a melody, in the way that they're doing it, and it's such a cool technique. You can do a lot to that bridge, and you get a sense of what the melody is later on, because Dizzy sings it. But right there, that call and response is very neat. And then we get the first solo from Sonny Stitt, and you can tell right away how much of a swinging player he is. He starts off kind of just nice and easy with some half notes, and then he gets busier by the start of the second A. He's got some classic bop language. Listen for how well he is going in and out of double time into regular eighth note time, and listen for how he ends his phrases. Right at 139, you can hear how well of a player he is when he's going from one section of a tune to another, and how cadential and you get a real sense of finality with how he's ending his phrasing at the end of that A section into the bridge. He's just really one of the best players to listen for in how to do that. And his double time lines later on during the bridge are absolutely killer. They're so in the pocket. His whole A section pretty much is all double time. So if you want a lesson in how to play double time better, listen for Sonny Stitt on his solo on Sunny Side Up, because he gives you so many chances to listen for that. later on in the solo, he's back to swinging cool eighth notes on that last A section, and the whole solo is just one chorus. And you'll notice that each horn player only does a one chorus solo on this track, but there's so much that Sonny Stitt puts into one chorus that it really is satisfactory in everything he's given me.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the things you're saying there. I really like how simply he starts the solo with the half notes, and then but it leads into just a super tasteful lick. And another thing, I won't say much because I think Max covered it well. One thing I love about Stitt is that he is really bop heavy, and there are a lot of bop heavy lines, but he mixes in a lot of soul and swing elements into it as well. So it doesn't just feel like it's all chops all the time. He really mixes in, some soul and some swing. And I want to echo what Max said. There's just incredible use of dynamics through his phrases. And so his phrases move dynamically. And also, like Max said, is there's this finality, and I like that you can tell when the A section is ending and you're moving into the bridge. You can tell it's a new section in the form, and the way he finishes one phrase and then starts another phrase over the bridge. I think that's a really cool approach, rather than just blowing all the way into the bridge and through the bridge. So yeah, I definitely agree with pretty much everything Max is saying there, and I like Stitt's approach there. And so next we get a muted trumpet solo from Dizzy Gillespie, which is very in character. He's one of the guys that's really known for using a mute while playing a solo. So yeah, I like he quotes the melody, but he doesn't do it right away, which I like. Sometimes you'll get guys who come in with their solo and they'll instantly quote the melody. He plays 4 bars, of his solo, and then he quotes the melody in the 5th bar of the A section at around 221. So I really like that. And there's a really cool repeated idea that he does from 244 to 251. Max, what did you think about Dizzy's solo on this one?
There's so much to get from anyone in their solo, but you really get a sense for how musical Dizzy Gillespie is when he's playing a solo on this track. He has a really neat use of space, in addition to the things that you're talking about. And if you just listen to how he's improvising, there's really nice falls from one note to another, and the way he's connecting certain notes is very unique, and it's bop oriented, but it's also, you can tell it's part of Dizzy's overall sound and approach. He's also good at adding in very rhythmic ideas. You can hear that on the start of the bridge. He also has some diminished licks and ideas at bars 6 through 8 of the bridge. So really listen for his treatment of the bridge versus Sonny Stitt. And both are great ways to play, but there's 2 different instruments and 2 different players, so they're going to approach it differently. And then after the Dizzy solo, we get Sonny Rollins. And again, they're just taking one chorus each. But to me, you can tell it's Sonny Rollins from his heftier tone. He sounds a little bit more unique. He's very playful, as I alluded to earlier. And you can hear that in this solo, where he really sticks to one idea and develops it during that first A section. He also has a really cool use of space. And then he does some busier lines in the second A section. And it kind of sounds like tritone sub, or he's messing around with chordal extensions at the start of the bridge at 351. He also has some nice rhythmic falls on his horn. Right at 402, you can hear that, and that is classic Sonny Rollins. You kind of get that from players like Joe Henderson, but the way Sonny is doing it right there at 402, that is, essential to some of the stuff Sonny Rollins typically does when he's improvising. And he also has some really nice triplet rhythms. Sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say he has some really nice triplet rhythms all during that last A section. And that's really kind of hard to do, to go in and out of the 8th note feel into the triplet feel. And he does that just very supremely.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that you say, and we'll talk about definitely into this album, is Sonny Rollins' feel. He has incredible feel, probably some of the best feel that you'll really hear. So I like that you touch on that there. I love the repeated idea to begin the solo. It's different than the way that Sonny Stitt starts a solo. Sonny Stitt starts kind of slow with half notes, kind of simple, and Sonny Rollins is a little more playful, just repeats an idea, which is cool. And yeah, I want to touch on something that Max said, is the very full sound that Rollins has, and that's how you can start to discern different saxophone players from each other, is listening to that and telling, oh man, like that's a little bit more of a full and fat sound when Sonny Rollins is playing versus Sonny Stitt. If I just say Sonny, we're going to confuse everybody so much. Sonny Rollins. And one thing that I really like that Sonny Rollins does on this is he has really good space in his solo. And one thing that allows to happen when you use space like that is you allow the rhythm section to swing and fill in that space. When you're just playing note continuously, it can be hard for the rhythm section to really feel the swing from the rhythm section. But when you give it space, you can feel the swing from the rhythm section that's filling in that space. So I really appreciate Sonny doing that, Sonny Rollins doing that on this solo.
Yeah, and space also allows for more interaction between the horn and the rhythm section. You know, there are different treatments you can do behind certain players in their improvisations that you don't do for other players. So if there's for instance, a player that's more rhythmic, then there's probably going to be more rhythmic interplay between the drummer and the soloist. If a player is more melodic, there might be more interplay between him and the piano player. So those instances can occur usually if you use space in your solo, at least at some point. And so Sonny Rollins is great at doing that. And he also allows for development to occur because of that space. He can take an idea, give it some time, and really build on that one idea he started with and go from there, which is something that he is one of the best at, not only on saxophone, but as just an overall musician in general. So really dig what Rollins is doing. And in this track, we get some vocal from Dizzy Gillespie. And he starts singing the head after the Sonny Rollins solo. And you can hear Sonny Stitt blowing behind him in the background on the first A section and Rollins on the second. And I really love how Dizzy sings the end of the A section, where he is singing the vocal line, "Fine as wine." And you can hear on the word wine that he's kind of humming it and building it while he's humming it and singing it. And that reminds me of kind of a classic trumpet move to do on kind of a plunger mute, where you've got the mute on the end of the bell on the trumpet, and he's kind of making the plunger muted sound with his voice. And so that's just a neat characteristic you can hear Dizzy do that I think is influenced by his trumpet playing.
Yeah, he's humming with like the M syllable, like and then he's saying like the whine. So you get that wah like kind of feeling, which is what you'd get from a mute, from a plunger mute that's coming off the horns, the wah kind of thing. So he's emulating that by humming and then saying whine. So that's really, really cool. And Dizzy's a really good singer, and I think it's just super cool to have Dizzy sing on the head out on this one. And it wouldn't be the most common thing to do on a straight, because this is just just super straight ahead album, and they're just like Dizzy just sings, which wouldn't be super common. You wouldn't hear that in many other settings unless you were doing the album with a singer specifically. So I love it. I think it's a cool thing to do here. Instead of having them play over the melody, just have Dizzy sing it. I love it.
And they keep the call and response that they did earlier, but now it's between Dizzy's vocals and the saxophones. So there's a lot of common compositional or really arranging techniques that are present in this version of On the Sunny Side of the Street. And I think that's why it's kind of one of the versions that you should really check out. And the ending is really cool too. They kind of end with this nice ending line that moves upward from the saxophones. And you can tell they're doing different harmonies there, and they end up on a final chord really well together. And so just how this tune is arranged and put together on this version of On the Sunny Side of the Street is really something to be admired.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of my top favorite recordings of this track. And just everyone's so killing in their solos. You can hear their different styles, and you get just a little bit of everything, and it's so well arranged, like Max said. So I definitely agree with that sentiment, and I think that's what makes it such a great recording of the tune. Let's get into the second track on the album. It's a Sonny Stitt original entitled Eternal Triangle. I really want to let Max do a lot of the talking on this one because this really heavily features Stitt and Rollins. So, Max, you just go ahead and take it away. I think you're going to have a lot of thoughts. And this is, if you're a saxophone player, this is like you want to dig into this because there's a lot going on, and Max is going to have a lot of cool things to point out on this one.
Well, I hope so. Definitely as a saxophone player, this is something you have to check out. Eternal Triangle, it is a Sonny Stitt original composition. It's basically a rhythm changes in B flat with different chords on the bridge. And that bridge, we have falling 2/5s, where they take up, 2 bars each for the first 4 bars, and then the 2/5s are moving by half step downward after each bar. So you get a 2/5 from a 2/5/1 chord progression per bar in the last 4 bars of the bridge.
And this just shows you how versatile 2/5s are. Like, we use them so often in jazz to get to different places. You can use if you're going to the 4 chord, you can use a 2/5 to get to the 4, the 2/5 of the 4, or like this, they're just using 2/5s in a chromatic fashion, half steps down, and it just shows you how versatile, and it's just like so cool to see 2/5s get used in different ways, and they sound so good. They sound so good like on the ear, so that's a cool different way to use 2/5s and to kind of change the changes to a rhythm change a little bit and make it unique.
It's also good to point out that they're playing pretty fast.
Yeah.
So it's a fast rhythm changes with a different bridge, and so that's the basis of the composition. So it's a little simpler, or more, not simpler, but it's more ingrained in a jazz musician's foundation to play well on a rhythm changes, because it's kind of one of the fundamental forms of jazz music, of classic jazz. And so that's what they're pulling from here, and they can play at a faster tempo because of that. And a lot of times you do a rhythm changes kind of up tempo. So that's another wow factor of this track. The other wow factor is that it is 14 minutes long. And that is because the jazz players on this version of Eternal Triangle, in my opinion, are allowed to be jazz musicians. So they are taking their time with solos. They're really kind of jamming out, but in a way that's not jam session oriented, but it really just lets the players stretch, and it's kind of freeing and I don't know, liberating to me as a saxophone player, because if you notice that how long the sax solos are, Sonny Stitt takes an 8 chorus sax solo, which is kind of uncommon, at least in a recording session setting. But here they let it happen, and I love that aspect of this version of Eternal Triangle. You'll notice on the track that Sonny Rollins actually has the first solo. He's got a lot of nice 8th note lines that are consistent and always moving. He's got a classic sharp 11 lick idea right at the 46-second mark. At 58 seconds, he's taking an idea and moving it downward to follow the chord changes. He's got some long phrasing at 120 to 129. You can hear how well he's connecting one idea to another, and just his dexterity on the instrument is unbelievable. There's lots of connecting ideas. He has some swing-oriented playing right at 132 to 136, and I think both of these guys, Sonny Stitt and Sonny Rollins, part of their foundational approach is influenced by swing era players, because they were coming up at the transition from swing to bop. And this, I just think that there's some of that in their playing that is evident from their improvisations. And you can hear that at the 132 to 136 mark from Sonny Rollins, as the backgrounds from the other 2 horn players enter in. He also has some nice quarter note ideas at the end of the bridge. I like kind of just doing the quarter notes sometimes, especially at a faster tempo. It just brings a nice dimension to the rhythm that you're playing, and it kind of lets kind of faster tempo improvisational ideas breathe a little bit better. So he's doing that during that bridge. And his rhythmic development at 2 minutes to 2 minutes and 8 seconds is really killer. He references the melody as well later on at 2:19. He keeps going till 2:54, and then we get kind of more rhythmic, playful stuff from him later on, and it's always super swinging. And at the tail end of his solo, he's kind of ending his solo at the top of the A section in the form of the tune into kind of where Sonny Stitt is supposed to start his solo. Typically you start at the top of the form, but Sonny Stitt really starts his solo at the in between the fourth and the fifth bar of the form, because the tail end of Sonny Rollins' solo goes into the top of the form.
Yeah, and we've seen this happen before. I just want to bring this up on our episode where we do T.S. Monk's two continents, one groove. When Helen Sung plays through the A section a little bit. So just unique, and it happens in jazz and for different reasons, So yeah, I think that's unique, Max. Why don't you tell us about this Sonny Stitt solo, because this is the one there's a lot to get into. Sonny Rollins, a fantastic solo, but this Sonny Stitt solo, like Max said, it's 8 courses. Let's get into this one a little bit, Max.
Well, as a PSA, public service announcement, I cannot really go over everything that's in Sonny Stitt's solo, when we talk about all the different licks and ideas and approaches he's taking. But there are many to mention that I'll talk about. And, Sonny Rollins' solo, I think, was 4 choruses. And so Sonny Stitt's is double the length. So that's
we would need a whole episode to talk about Sonny Stitt's solo. Like, if we wanted to let Max really get, he could take an hour talking about this. So we'll just get the most important parts of it from Max on this.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We'll do a condensed version. But just to say that Sonny Stitt's solo, it's always on point. And as I mentioned, he kind of starts in the 5th or 6th bar of the form because of the bleed in from the end of Rollins' solo. But he comes in hot with 8th notes galore. He's not skipping a beat coming in, even though it's later on in the form than where you would normally start. And so it doesn't deter from what he's doing at all. Again, we've talked about his cadential phrasing and how he's great at ending one section and going into another. You can hear that at the end of the second A section here. At 3:18, he plays a really common idea that I've heard him do on records with Gene Ammons. And some of the licks that Sonny Stitt does are some of the licks or ideas that Gene Ammons also does, or vice versa. And you can hear at 3:18, he's kind of doing that. It's a very common blues or rhythm changes lick where he's moving upward on the horn very rhythmically. But it's super soulful. It's super in the pocket. And it's just, it brings in both the great thing about jazz improvisation, both what we would intellectually think about an idea and what we would emotionally feel about a rhythmic or heady improvisational idea. So Sonny Stitt is great at bringing those two together into his playing. He's not just technique and he's not just soul, but he's both, and he really brings that out at different times when he's soloing. At 3:34, you can hear a falling 8th note idea that matches the falling 2/5 chords that we were talking about during that part of the bridge. And it's so perfect how well he lines up what he's playing on the horn with where the rhythm section is and the chords, where they start and move to the next one. He's got some false fingerings at 3:44 where we talk about with the saxophone, fingering a note and then adding or taking away fingers to change the sound of the note. And so that's kind of a swing era idea. And so he does that at 3:44. And I think at 4:10, he has some really nice, awesome diminished rising ideas. And there's always a reference to the blues somewhere in a Stitt solo. So he does a blues lick 4:17 to 4:20. Has some great falling 8th note ideas again at 4:27. And during that part of the bridge, he does that in conjunction with rising 8th note ideas during that same section. So you can hear how he plays differently up the horn and down the horn in those different sections. And then at 4:54, he's doing more of that. At 511 is another diminished idea, this time falling downward. So a lot of times he'll move upward with the diminished lick, but at 511 it's the opposite direction. There's another diminished lick at 534, and he's got some nice swing rhythmic ideas, 552 to 557, on what I call the wobble, which is, the B flat swing era thing where you're fingering E flat, but you skip the G finger on the tenor sax and you get a wobble in between the B flat and the G note. And you can hear him referencing that right around that 552, 557 mark. He has some repeating blues licks at 605. And so that proves, again, it's okay to repeat an idea. Altogether, like I said, it's 8 courses of soloing. The amount of language in what he's doing is absolutely incredible. The way he connects his ideas and moves seamlessly from one improv idea to the next is something to be adored. I dare any saxophone player to play a better solo on this than the Sonny Stitt solo. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, and like we had mentioned, this Sonny Stitt solo, it's just one of the most expansive saxophone solos I've heard in a long time. There's so much going on. Like Max touched on so many different things, and he just has such an extensive use of different techniques, such as rhythm, scales, licks, ideas, and like Max said, how to connect them all together. So this is a must-listen solo. There's so much going on. It's kind of like a textbook on how to play the jazz saxophone and how to connect different ideas together.
And it's always swinging. It always feels good too.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is the technique there, but the soul is there too because of how well it's in the pocket. And I just think his solo is just a little more on point than Sonny Rollins here. And I hate to do the whole comparison, which tenor player did the better solo on the track. That's kind of a cliche when you have 2 tenor players on the same recording. But here, I think Sonny Stitt takes it, and to me, there's really no question about it. Even though I love what Sonny Rollins is doing, just everything we're getting from Stitt, and it is a Stitt composition, so maybe he felt like he could because it's stuff he's worked out, it's stuff he's into, it's his own song. So, maybe he felt more free to take it and run with it. But there's so much from Sonny Stitt here. I don't know how you can't learn something from the solo.
Yeah, and I really just love how they let each of them kind of stretch out on this one. And it feels like it's definitely rooted in the bebop style. In the swing era, we get a lot of kind of multiple soloists, one chorus apiece, that kind of thing. And then in bebop, guys like Charlie Parker, they really start to flesh out this style where they're starting to stretch out because they have a lot of things. There's a lot of development that goes on in bebop. So these guys are working through a lot of ideas, and it just kind of leads to this era where guys get to stretch a little bit more and kind of showcase their technique and their skills a little bit more. So I really appreciate this, and it's definitely, it fits. And then they get into kind of a sax trading kind of bebop battle style section, which is really cool. Max, why don't you tell us about that trading section?
Yeah, the other cliche that exists when you have 2 tenor players on a recording session is, where is the battle? Where is the trading?
Yeah.
And so here we get that. We get Sonny Rollins coming in at 6:22 minute mark for trading with Sonny Stitt. So we get tenor versus tenor. He comes in quoting a very common rhythm changes melody, Lester Leaps In, named after Lester Young, the great tenor player. So he's kind of quoting that melody to Lester Leaps In when he comes in, and they're trading 4s. So Rollins has taken 4 bars of a solo, and then Stitt takes the next 4 bars, and they go back and forth. At 6:39, you can hear Rollins playing an idea and moving up a half step. So that's very clever. At 6:53, Rollins plays a song quote or an idea, and then Stitt, when he comes in for his part to trade, he comes in with the same song quote or idea. And so that's a common, soloistic transitioning technique to do. And it's just playful and fun. If I quote what you're doing and you quote what I'm doing, we're going back and forth. It's kind of like banter between 2 friends. And, there's a lot of conversations going on when they're trading.
Yeah, I just love how seamlessly, you kind of said banter, like it seems like they're able to just kind of like pass the baton or the torch like back and forth, like with how seamless they're able to transition, from each 4 bars. I just really like that. And yeah, they'll kind of play with an idea that the other one played, or riff, copy a lick that the other person played. They're just really, really good at this, and so I definitely dig this as well.
Absolutely. There's a cool thing about this trading section because they start trading 4s, and then along the way they start trading 8s.
Yep.
And I don't know if that was planned or if it just kind of happened organically. Usually it would happen the other way around, where you start trading 8s, and then as you go you diminish the length. So then you would trade 4s after the fact. But here they flip it. And I don't know if that was planned or if it was organic, but that's a cool thing about this trading section.
It could have just been that one of them, instead of taking 4 one time, they just took 8. They had more to say, and they took 8, and they're like, all right, this is what we're doing now. We're going 8 bars,
Yeah, I feel like that's what happened with this one. But there's a lot of cool stuff in their trading section. You can hear how Rollins's rhythmic thing is going, right at 719 and 726, where he's playing more rhythmically than melodically, or less technically in terms of how many notes he's playing. He's more rhythmic sometimes. So that trading 8s happens right at the 737, and it gets a little bit. They kind of get playful with the harmony that they're doing right at 811. You can hear that. And also you can hear some cool stuff from the rhythm section. You can hear the bass a lot of times when those out moments happen. He's just plucking one note constantly. I don't know if it's
just
the 5,
the root or the 5. Yeah.
Yeah, usually it's the root or 5, but he's just doing that da 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 da. And it's cool to. Also, it's a 14-minute long song, so the bass is probably doing that to give his fingers a rest. I don't know. So anyway, you can also hear some references to some Thelonious Monk changes on rhythm changes that they're pulling from. There's some cool ideas at 836 from Sonny Rollins. And then the trumpet gets a solo after the saxophone trading. And so Dizzy comes in right around the end of the 8-minute into the 9-minute mark. And I'm not sure why Dizzy did not go first, because of the energy that we get from the tenor trading and the amazing Sonny Stitt solo and the really cool, playful Sonny Rollins solo. There's just so much energy there musically that I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't have Dizzy solo on this track, or maybe have him do a shorter first solo or something. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I think it just does Dizzy such a disservice, because one thing is his solo is super swinging, but it's just it's so hard for him to match the energy that's been put forward. So to put him after these two guys and what the battle, it I don't think it doesn't seem like it's in the right place to me. It seems out of place. And so yeah, he could have gone first, or just not have a solo on this one. I don't know. I don't think it was on him. I think it's more of a compositional thing on this one.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because we just had almost 9 minutes of saxophone galore.
Yeah.
And it's hard to come in, with something super special after that. I mean, it's possible. And Dizzy, he has a nice solo. He has some really cool high notes, has some really neat blues ideas right around 9:55. He's very rhythmic at 10:12. I love also the background ideas that happen behind Dizzy from the saxes. It sounds like they're quoting a lick from the Jumpin' Blues. If you don't know that tune, it's a blues melody, and it sounds like the last 4 bars of the Jumpin' Blues melody is in their background idea. So that's a cool connection there. So that's something to listen for during Dizzy's solo, is the way the backgrounds are being used. And again, a lot of that time we're getting some repeating back and forth to one note plucking from the bass player intermittently through Dizzy's solo. So he's doing what he was doing during some of the trading from the tenor saxes underneath Dizzy. So it's cool to listen for the bass playing as well underneath Dizzy's solo. And then we also get a piano solo from Ray Bryant. I don't know what you think about the piano solo. I wasn't expecting a rhythm section solo at all on this track, but they do have one.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention before I get into the piano solo is the stamina for these guys to be able to play at this tempo for 14 minutes, the rhythm section. There's
Yep.
definitely like a shout out there, and it doesn't drag at all. Like their tempo is pushing and swinging the whole time. So yeah, it's a really, and so I'm not surprised to just get him kind of at times just be like, all right, let's just hit the root for a while and, let my hands recover a little bit before I start
Yeah.
walking at, whatever crazy tempo we're at. But yeah, so I also was not really expecting a piano solo on this one. Like we said with Dizzy, it can be extremely hard to match the energy from horn players. Even it can be hard to match a trumpet player's energy on the piano going after a trumpet, and this is just a track that's so burning and there's so much energy to it. But I think that Ray Bryant does a really nice job on the solo with what he's got going on. There's a lot of bop lines, which makes sense given the tempo and the changes, but he also is able to incorporate some good use of rhythm and space. And one thing is there's stuff going on in the left hand, but it's done pretty subtly in the beginning of the solo. It's very dynamically. You can barely hear what he's doing in his left hand, but he is doing stuff in his left hand. But then he uses his left hand to build the dynamics throughout the solo. And by the end of the solo, he's using his left hand, you can hear it pretty loudly. So I think that's a cool technique that he's doing there. It can be hard to match the energy, but I think he does a good job of at least building his solo well throughout, even though it's kind of an unexpected piano solo to have. He does some cool things in it, and I think his left hand is pretty cool there.
Absolutely. We also get a drum feature because we get some trading fours with the drums back and forth with Dizzy. And so that's kind of cool. Everyone does kind of get a chance to shine on this track because you can hear what the bass is doing behind players, and then everyone else does have some soloing. So that's a neat aspect to this Eternal Triangle track. And at 1308, 1320, you can hear some really cool high notes that Dizzy does and how he treats those and goes in and out of them. It's really special. And you can kind of hear why his nickname is Dizzy Gillespie, because everything he's doing on the trumpet is making me a little dizzy. But it's great stuff. And then they just do the head out one time through, and there's kind of a cool sweeping upward outro lick that they do. And then the track just kind of stops after those outro licks.
Yeah, and I just want to say that it's pretty easy to feature everyone when you play a track for 14 minutes. So it's there definitely is more of a feature of the saxophone players, but everyone gets a little bit of a turn on this one, which when you play a track for a quarter of an hour, that's easier to do.
I think it's just amazing how long Sonny Stitt's solo is. I can't get enough. I think I'll be referencing that track for the rest of my life. I mean, it's crazy.
That would be an incredible one to transcribe. How long would it take you to transcribe that solo? If you just were listening and transcribing, not using any kind of aid, how long do you think it would take you?
I don't know. It would take quite a while.
I feel like it would take weeks. I mean, unless you were just at it hours and hours a day.
Oh, yeah. I know. It would take weeks for you to do it the right way. A lot of times when you're transcribing, you don't want to do too much, for each session that you transcribe. But if you do, 8 bars a day, maybe, you do, you would have to do
8 choruses times. Oh,
I don't know. 8 bars a day times 8 choruses is, I don't know.
A lot. That's a lot of days. I mean, how many bars is the form? Is it a 32 bar form?
Yes.
Oh my God. I want to do some quick math. Hold on. You keep talking for a second. I'm going to do some quick math.
Well, it is something I've thought about doing. I think I will transcribe the solo. It will just take forever.
There are 256 bars in Sonny Stitt's solo. If you did 8 bars a day, it would take you 32 days, a whole month, and some change.
Just to transcribe it. And then, it's all about how well do you do it playing along with him? Can you get it up to tempo? Can you get all the nuances? Can you get his sound? Can you get his articulations? Can you get just his overall style? That takes a while to do. And so with that long of a solo, you're looking at probably 2.5 to 3 months of really, if you really want to do it the right way, getting all those nuances in there. Yeah, it's going to take you a quarter of a year.
Yeah, especially with like this, like the stuff he's playing on this solo. It can be hard enough for me to learn one chorus of a solo when it's just like pretty simple and bluesy. Sometimes with some runs, it can take me a while. Some of the stuff he's doing on this it's not going to be like let me learn these 3 bars or 4 bars in a matter of 15 minutes. Like it's going to take you, it might take you over an hour or two just to try to nail down, especially getting it up to tempo too. So
also, there's likely, quite a bit of repetition, a lot of repeating ideas or doing ideas in a number of different ways, but foundationally they're almost the same. And so that's the cool thing about both Sonny Rollins and Sonny Stitt is that they do that really, really well. So, there would be some repeating ideas in there for sure. So, some things would already be under your fingers as you go along the transcription and really hammering it out on your instrument. So that's one thing about it that may speed up that process a little bit. But yeah, it would definitely take a while.
I challenge anyone who's listening who is a saxophone player to transcribe and learn this entire solo. I will be amazed if anyone is, that.
Well,
it'd make you so much better of a player through doing it. So it'd be worth it. But I'd just be amazed if someone took the time and dedicated it to learning the solo.
Yeah, cats have done it, I'm sure. But yeah, it would take a while, and getting it, right with Stitt, that's the key factor when you transcribe something is getting all those nuances in there as well as the notes and the rhythms. So it's definitely a challenge, but there's a lot in there to learn from. And then on the album, we get a blues number, the next track on the album, called After Hours. And so this is a 12/8, 12-bar blues song, originally written by Avery Parrish, first recorded by the Erskine Hawkins band or orchestra in 1940. And if you don't know, Avery Parrish was a piano player, born in Alabama in 1917, graduated in 1935. Excuse me. And by that time, apparently it's been mentioned in newspaper clippings that he was married to the vocalist Velma Middleton, which
How
we
crazy.
Isn't that wild? We were just talking about Velma on Satchmo at Pasadena during that episode. She's on a couple of tracks from that album, and she did so much with Louis Armstrong. We were just talking about Velma Middleton.
Yeah, it's crazy the different connections, and we'll get them all the time of people, the jazz community, just so many people that knew each other, and I'm married and different connections. So that's a wild fact on that one.
Yeah, so that was Avery Parrish. That was married to her, I think, very briefly, but still, really cool connection. If you don't know, Parrish worked with Erskine Hawkins, who was a trumpeter and band leader. He's really known for the tune Tuxedo Junction, which was copied or covered, rather, from other big bands in the early 40s. And Avery Parrish got into a bar fight in 1943, and unfortunately that fight kind of disabled him, and he couldn't really play after that. And unfortunately, he passed in 1959 due to unknown causes. Some people say he fell down a flight of stairs. Apparently, he was a really heavy drinker, and he was not careful with substances. And he's just one of those kind of sad stories we see in the history of jazz, where cats they kind of lose focus and they get distracted, and maybe they had a hard upbringing or something that really ultimately ends their presence on this planet, and just creates a hard, really sad demise to the endings of their life, especially this one with Avery, because he had 16 years or so where he couldn't physically play. And so if you've been doing that for your life, and that's been your goal and what you've been all about, that's, really unfortunate.
Yeah, there are definitely a number of really sad stories. The story of Lee Morgan, we won't talk about that now, but we can get into that when we do a Lee Morgan album. There are just some sad stories in jazz, and like Max was saying, different things, and jazz musicians back then weren't known as making the healthiest decisions and choices. So yeah, definitely some guys who we didn't get to get their full life or catalog or that kind of thing. So, but yeah, let's get into the tune itself. It starts out with a piano feature from Ray Bryant, and this feature is very, very blues oriented. And when I say blues, it's more like a traditional blues pianist, such as if you were listening to Ray Charles or Otis Spann, than listening to like a bop jazz piano player, which I think is cool. Some like purist might find this kind of hokey or not swinging to be playing in this style that's it's not super jazz. It's more traditional blues with a lot of the trills and stuff instead of doing like, some runs and stops and things like that. I think it's cool. I think it fits the fact that the song is in 12/8 pretty well. So yeah, there's a boogie woogie kind of stride going on in his left hand, which is very reminiscent of Ray Charles. If you think about the tune, The Mess Around, that kind of boogie woogie stride. This is a much slower tune, but he's doing a very similar thing, which is highlighted by his brother on the bass as well. They're kind of playing the same rhythm there. And yeah, like I said, from 127 to 154, it's just blues trills on his right hand. But one thing that's cool is he's doing chord changes with his left hand, which is pretty cool, and it sounds pretty good. But yeah, it's just a blues trill for almost 30 seconds there. So yeah, they really start outlining the 12/8 feel at 207, which Ray Bryant kind of starts that, and then the rest of the rhythm section kind of picks up on it. And they're kind of outlining that feel, and I think that's really hip, and I really dig that. I think it's a really cool intro. It's definitely unique, and it fits the style of the song really well. Max, what did you think about the intro on this one?
I love it, and I love that it's a piano feature. You get Ray Bryant, kind of originally from the gospel church tradition, from the, I think, very blues-drenched tradition, and you can hear that here with what Ray Bryant is doing. You don't get the horns coming in until the 3-minute and 18 mark. So the first 3 minutes is all about Ray Bryant, all about the piano, all about the blues, all about the 12/8. You're right, it's a little more, I don't know, pop influenced, but I love the 12/8 feel. It doesn't bother me. I love a traditional blues, and so I love everything Ray Bryant is doing. And then towards the tail end of Bryant's playing, he's kind of referencing and playing the main melody of the tune, After Hours. So he kind of starts getting featured, and then he goes into the melody before the horns come in right around the 320 mark. And we get a first horn solo from Dizzy Gillespie, and he has some really nice ideas, some cool lip falls, nice use of space. Overall, very well thought out blues playing, and each of the players on this album are great at playing the blues, and I love that you can hear that on this track, After Hours, because they each showcase their blues playing really well.
Yeah, one thing that I love is that Dizzy goes first on this track. It kind of bothered us on the last track when he didn't go first. I think it does a great job of just kind of letting the solos develop well, having Dizzy go first. He, like Max said, a really great use of space, lots of space on this one, and really blues-oriented lines. And one thing that I think is interesting to note is he's pretty much just using the blues scale. There's not a whole lot that he's drawing from other scales. He's basically staying on the blues scale the entire time, and it just shows you how much you can do with just the blues scale and how versatile it is, and how you can take it and manipulate it and use space and use different ideas to play over the blues scale. Max, what do you think about that?
I would say a lot of what he's doing is foundational to the blues in general. If you ask me, the blues scale does not exist. And I know I'm making some people upset or making some people question my validity as what I do. But to me, the blues scale is something that's made up in order to teach beginning improvisers something to pull from when they're starting to improvise on a blues or in jazz in general. And so to me, it's an educational technique to think about the blues scale. I don't think Dizzy is thinking blues scale. I think he's just using similar notes to what we refer to as the blues scale, in ways that are reminiscent of things essential to blues playing, especially on the horn. Because in quote unquote the blues scale, you get the sharp 11, you get the flat 3, you get some blue notes. And so I think he's pulling from blue notes and blues ideas and common blues technique when soloing, not from the blues scale. I think that's something we can think about it now after the fact, and reference what he's doing or what these players are doing. Maybe he's pulling more from the flat 3s, or he's bending notes, or he's moving from the root to the sharp 11 down to the 4. Maybe he's playing off the 4 more, which is a common blues technique, but he's not necessarily doing the blues scale.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is that what we know as the blues scale now, he's pulling a lot from that versus using things, different scales, diminished scales necessarily,
right.
Different bop scale. What would be play in a bop setting? He's hitting a lot of those blue notes with the the sharp 4, the 4, that kind of thing. So
yeah, I think you're right about that. And then we get a second solo on the track with Sonny Rollins. And again, there's some nice use of space. There's a lot of blues techniques that he's doing. And at the 7-minute to 7:27 mark, you can hear some of my favorite type of Rollins and his soloing on this album. He's messing around with one note and bending it and doing it almost, he's almost kind of screaming some notes. It's a very emotional, very emotive idea, what he's doing. And in the background, you can hear Dizzy or somebody verbally, vocally yell out, yeah, in the background, or cop the idea on his instrument. It's a very blues-oriented, emotional moment in the Sonny Rollins solo.
Yeah, I really like how deep he digs into this part, and you can tell he's really feeling it at this point. And one thing I kind of want to mention, there's something I want to go back to, but yeah, you hear Dizzy kind of get into it. There are also other points on this track. At 5:06 during Dizzy's solo, you can kind of hear some talking in the background of the recording, and there's two different things about this. When it's part of the actual recording and it's Dizzy reacting to something that's going on, I like hearing that. But there are times when you can just hear background talking and you can't tell who it is or what the purpose is on this recording. And I don't feel I feel like it can be distracting at times. When I was listening to this, I had my headphones on and I was listening, and I thought that my TV had turned on because I heard talking in the background at that point. So I think that can be a little distracting at points. And another thing is the transition from Dizzy's solo to Sonny Rollins' solo. It almost sounds like the song is ending, but then they kind of keep it rolling into Rollins' solo. And I just feel like it's kind of an awkward change in the feel from the drummer before they really settle in to Rollins' solo. But they do this transition again a few times, and it's just this time that they do it for the first time, it feels like there's a bit of a lack of clarity. I don't know. It doesn't feel super intentional, and it feels like there's just a bit of a lack of clarity in what's going on in this transition. So I'm like, oh, the song's ending. Oh, wait, they're going to keep going. And I was like, was that on purpose? What was that? So that's something to note in that transition of solos.
I think part of that is they may not have known the solo order, or they may not have gone over what the solo order was going to be. So they're looking at each other, who's going to take the next solo. And, a lot of times I'll just, see who calls it first. And I can be a little hesitant to take the first solo if there's multiple horns on the gig, or if, I'm not the band leader. So to me, that's what I suspect, that's what occurred. Also, this track, After Hours, is 12 minutes long. So this is the other track on the album that's really long. And so maybe another thing is, the rhythm section has to keep up the energy, or they want to change up maybe what they're doing for the next soloist or something.
Hmm.
So I just think there's a lot transitioning there, not just one solo to another, but maybe they didn't know who was soloing next, and maybe rhythm section wanted to do something different.
Yeah, yeah. So that, yeah, there's a lot going on there. I just wonder what the intention there was, like I was saying. But yeah, I really do like Rollins solo. And then they do a similar transition, like I said, to the first one into Sonny Stitt solo, but this one is much more clean, and it doesn't sound like they're trying to end the tune. It just actually sounds like a smooth transition into Sonny Stitt solo, and I really wonder if this is the transition they were trying to do the first time, and they just hit it cleanly the second time.
Probably. You're probably right about that. And then the Sonny Stitt solo, I think, really comes out to me personally. I love his song quote at 7:43, and he starts off kind of with like half notes, and he's just
Hmm.
really letting the feel breathe. He has some great falling diminished ideas at 8:03, 8:09 to 8:13. It's just superb jazz language he's doing. At 8:30, great blues ideas. 9:12, he quotes "When the Saints Go Marching In," and he's pulling off from that opening line of the melody, "The Saints Go Marching In." There's also just a lot of great 1 bar and 2 bar ideas that we get from Sonny Stitt. You can hear some longer note ideas at 9:40 to the 10-minute mark. So he's pulling from all sorts of places and messing around with different lengths of notes and different rhythms and different time feels. And we get some faster, common Sonny Stitt lines and some great improv ideas at the 11:03 to 11:07 mark. And so there's just some really cool things that Sonny Stitt is doing on his solo.
Yeah, he comes in super swinging on this one. Like Max said, I really like that descending, diminished lick at 8:03. There's one thing that he does that's really cool is he takes a line and he repeats it at 8:43, but then the second time that he repeats the line, he kind of seamlessly works it into a moving like line after that. And I think that's really a cool technique, is to take an idea and repeat it, but the second time that you play it, let it lead into something else, which is cool. And I really like the mix of kind of longer notes and ideas along with like the faster moving bop lines and the blues ideas. I think it's just he's really showcasing his versatility on this album, and how great of a player technically is, and so many different styles and techniques. And one thing is at 10:03 we get that blues piano trill that I was talking about under the sax solo, and it just really is reminiscent of a more traditional blues setting, something you might hear in like a Chicago blues setting, maybe a T-Bone Walker, one of the guys playing behind him. So I think that's interesting to note there. And then they do this transition again that I talked about, and it's clean again this time going into the piano solo. So it feels like this is, they've got it down. The first time they kind of flubbed it, and now it's clean the rest of the time through.
Yeah, that transition here, they're going back to the melody with Ray Bryant riffing in the background. And I love what Ray Bryant is doing behind the horns when they're playing the melody. You can hear that trad blues approach, like you were saying. It's more like a blues oriented group there than a jazz bebop oriented group. I also love how they come down dynamically with the dynamics. They're they're lowering the energy a little bit and just the overall volume as they play the melody out, and it eventually fades out. And so this is, I think, the only track on the album that fades out.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely an important thing to note, because this is such a high energy album that it's good to have kind of a release from that at points. And that's one thing they do well here, is that they kind of bring the dynamics down and kind of ease out of that high energy. So let's get into the final track on the album, entitled "I Know That You Know." Max, why don't you tell us a little bit about this one?
Yeah, this song was first performed in 1926. It's a classic tune written by Vincent Youmans, who was a Broadway composer known for songs like "More Than You Know," "Tea for Two," and "Without a Song." He's really known for writing short 3 or 4 note melodies and repeating them, but underneath the melodic idea, he's shifting or changing the harmony underneath each repetition. And you can hear that in his composition Without a Song, which is a tune I like to call sometimes on a gig. Um, it's just really cool the way the harmony moves underneath a simpler melody. And Vincent Youmans was great in his compositions of doing that. He worked with almost any lyricist you can think of: Ira Gershwin, Gus Kahn, Oscar Hammerstein, Irving Caesar. So he worked with a lot of different people, but his career was cut short due to him catching, and he had a long battle with tuberculosis. And so he passed in 1947 at the young age of 46 due to his bout with tuberculosis. And he wrote, roughly 100 songs, maybe less. But I think quite a few of those, probably 1/5 of those became jazz standards or common American jazz songs that people covered. So you'll see Vincent Youmans' name quite a bit when you research the history of some of these tunes.
Yeah, and another thing we spoke about, guys, different reasons in passing and some sad endings, just modern medicine, things like tuberculosis and things like that. In the 40s, it was much harder to get through things like that. We talked about Velma Middleton, and when she came down with, what was it that she...
Well, she had a stroke.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were on tour out of the country, and apparently she did not get really well because I don't know if she had a coma, but she was basically dealing with that stroke for a month, and then she passed away. So the health facilities weren't up to par. Maybe she wasn't getting the right medicine. And so you're right. That's an instance with Velma Middleton's passing where you can see, just the development of Western medicine and how things were different back then.
Yeah, for sure. So you do have this kind of thing where some people didn't live as long of lives as maybe they would today. So that's definitely a case of what happened here. And I really like, this is a cool and slightly different melody on the head on this one. It kind of has a different feel to it than the other melodies on the album.
Yeah, and this song is not very well covered. I know that it's not one of the top 2 or 3 Vincent Youmans tunes that you'll hear cats play, but it is an interesting arrangement of the song that this version, is. It's a faster tempo. It's got a really cool intro because they use kind of the opening lick of the melody as an intro, and they repeat it followed by 4 bars of drum solo. So they do that 2 times through where they have this intro idea and then drums take it, intro idea, drums, which occurs twice, and then the head starts. And the head is basically a 16-bar form, A and an A prime section. And Dizzy, if you can hear the way they're arranging the melody, Dizzy plays the main melody, and then the saxes have a line underneath that. And it is a really kind of burning tempo, right around 330 beats per minute. So they're fast tempos, they're not an issue for these players because of how great they are and how well they're interacting. And here we get a Sonny Rollins solo first, and he absolutely destroys it. I love what Sonny Rollins is doing. And, before we were talking about how a rhythm section treats one soloist maybe differently than another. And so here they're doing that. The rhythm section is simply playing, and they're doing rhythmic hits on B1 every 2 bars. But in between, it's open space, and Sonny Rollins is taking it. So you can hear how well his time is, how well he develops ideas, how superbly, he can keep time for himself. He doesn't need the rhythm section to take up those spaces. And so just hear what Sonny Rollins is doing during his solo, and during the whole solo it's unaccompanied other than those hits every 2 bars on B1 from the rhythm section. It's absolutely killer. What do you think of that?
Dude, I didn't know what to think of it. I just have Sonny Rollins solo, what the heck. his, like you said, his time and feel while playing over these hits, it's mind-boggling. It's incredible how good his time and feel is. It's impeccable. So yeah, and the lines are awesome. And one cool thing that he does, which I noticed, is like the only time he'll pause is during the hit on the one. So that's, I'm assuming, when he's breathing too, because he has incredible breath support. Sometimes he'll play a line and I'm just like, does he ever breathe? But yeah, one thing he'll do is he'll play an idea, and then the only space that he's leaving is that hit. So it's kind of like hit, licks, and then hit. And so it's just a really cool, really well done section. If the song would have ended after this, I would have been like, okay, that was the coolest thing I've ever heard. That was awesome. Like, so it was just, it was so good, that part.
I think the main, if you really want to dig in and learn something from this Sonny Rollins solo, is pay attention to his phrasing. Sometimes he's doing a 2-bar phrase, sometimes it's a 4-bar phrase, sometimes it's short 3 and 4 beat phrases, but his ability to move in and out of those phrase lengths is otherworldly, and it works to create a stream of ideas and just a consistency to his solo, rather than playing lick to lick to lick over harmony to harmony to harmony. So the way he's connecting ideas, the way where he's putting those ideas is really a lesson, and just, it's not even a lesson. It's something to really enjoy and admire, and to really get into and see how playful he is with what he's doing. He's not doing it in a silly way. I don't mean playful as in he's being silly with it or insensitive to the music or something. I mean it in that it's otherworldly. It's beyond artistry. It's something he is one of the best at in this music of doing. It's just so accurate, the way he's being playful with his own ideas. And it illustrates the not only the amount of jazz language that he knows, but how well he can simply do something, but it goes beyond the language and goes beyond the basic ideas that we all try to ingrain as jazz players.
Yeah, I think when Max says playful, this is an analogy that just came to my head. It's not playful as in like he's being silly or he's messing around. It's playful as in he's so talented, he's so well studied, that it's almost, I compare it to a guy like, take Kyrie Irving, a basketball player. He is so good with his handles that it's sometimes he can be playful in a way that like he's just showing off his skill because he's so good at what he does. That's kind of the same thing Sonny Rollins does, is he's so good that he can take it to a whole nother level, and it can seem he can just play around with it because it's that easy for him. That's what came to mind when you said that. It's just a guy that's so good at what he's doing. He can play around with different things, and he can do it so well, and it can seem so easy for him even though it's not.
That's exactly what I'm getting at, or trying to portray, is his ability to do that, and the way he does it, his phrasing, it's beyond believable. So after that, unfortunately, the song doesn't end. we got to keep going. And there's some more great playing as well. But there's just so much you get from that Sonny Rollins section that it's hard to get as much from everything else, unfortunately. So we do get a trumpet solo right at the 1:56 mark. There's some fast moving bop lines. There's lots of starting an idea on a high note and falling from that high note. So just more classic Dizzy improvisatory movement on the horn. And you can just tell how well he is in his dexterity on the instrument, and just his lines, how not only how fast moving they are, but how well he goes in and out of them.
Yeah, and once again, Dizzy kind of feels like he gets the short end of the stick with having to follow up such an incredible section by Sonny Rollins on this one. But Dizzy really digs into his bop roots, and he kind of shows us why he's the innovator and the premier bop trumpet player of the era with the lines. The lines are just moving so well. He's moving so much, and they're just woven into the changes really well. So Dizzy just really kind of shows us why he is who he is. So this solo is really good from Dizzy, but it's just hard. That section from Sonny Rollins, just what in the world? It's hard to follow up, but yeah. So And then after that, we get a Sonny Stitt solo, and he comes in burning hard, and there are just lots of really fast-moving lines. And it just seems like on this one, he just really lets go on the chops and he shows what he's made of. It doesn't seem like he's super concerned with like taking an idea and developing it as much as just really getting like digging into the bop lines and just really showing the chops, which is cool. I mean, because he's really good and he's got all the chops. So it's cool to hear him just kind of go at it like that.
Yeah, his runs are really amazing. You can hear there are a couple of moments in this solo if you compare it to his Eternal Triangle solo. Like, I think here there's a couple moments where it's not quite as perfect, or he's kind of letting some space pass unintentionally, it seemed, rather than the Eternal Triangle solo, where I think every moment is killer and every idea is well placed and connects well to the next one. There's a couple moments here where it's not quite as perfect. You can hear that kind of at 337 to 340. That's kind of one moment I'm talking about. And there's really only one or two really of those moments here, but you try to listen for that. And he also does some kind of high screeching, not so perfect altissimo notes right at 419. I dig the emotion and the the gutsy approach there, and just the mentality of I'm going to go for it, and whatever comes out comes out. So it's not quite perfect, but it is really kind of swinging, and it feels good, and it's fun. And it just seems like overall this Sonny Stitt solo is just a little bit more raw. If you were to compare and contrast it with his Eternal Triangle solo, but it's great musicianship either way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. He's kind of just showing off his musicianship, it feels like, on this one, which is cool to see. Well, let's get into our top threes and our not so hot. There are only 4 tracks on the album, so there's not a whole lot of super lot of decision making to make. Max, why don't you tell us your top 3 and your not so hot track first?
Well, because of the amazing Sonny Stitt solo and the fact that it's a Sonny Stitt composition and we get just really some nice stretching on that track, my number 1 is Eternal Triangle. I really can't think of a reason why it would not be my number 1.
That's a very Max thing of you to do there.
Yeah. Number 2, I have On the Sunny Side of the Street. I love the vocal and the arranging, and it's just a fun version, and it's always swinging. Number 3 is After Hours. I love the blues, and I love the 12/8 feel that they're doing, and it's a really nice piano feature. And there's just some fantastic blues playing on this track, After Hours. My not so hot, because it had to exist. All I had left to pick from was I Know That You Know, except for that Sonny Rollins solo during the hits from the rhythm section. That would be the reason why it's not a not so hot, but there has to be a not so hot. And I just think there are some moments in I Know That You Know that are just not quite up to par with the other 3 tracks, that it unfortunately had to be my not so hot. But I love that Sonny Rollins solo section. It is unbeatable and really hard to match in terms of quality and energy.
Yeah, so on my top 3, I actually had On the Sunny Side of the Street as my number 1. I just think when I think of this album and when I think of that song, this is one of those recordings that kind of sticks out to me. And I just think it's kind of just such a perfect arrangement of the tune. So for me, it's my number 1 on the album. But then in kind of a 1A, 1B kind of fashion, my number 2 track is Eternal Triangle. It's just such a good showcase of these players and their abilities, and just such a cool jam. I want to say jam, but just like, yeah, just a stretch and just an exploration of these 2 saxophone players. So it deserves to be 1A, 1B with On the Sunny Side of the Street. And then I really do like, in my number 3 spot, I have After Hours. I just think it's cool to do blues in a different way. This isn't the most traditional jazz way to do a blues song. It's different. and I enjoy it, and I think it's cool that they take that, that approach to it. And then, like Max said, my Not So Hot, I know that and it almost made my top 3 solely due to Rollins' solo. It almost bumped out After Hours, but I couldn't just do it just because of the solo, although honorable mention, Sonny Rollins' solo over the hits on I Know That it deserves love for sure.
It should almost be like a thing where they make that solo section, they put it out as a single.
Yes, exactly. Oh my God. It really is incredible, that section from Sonny Rollins.
Yeah. I don't know how you would splice that up, but a Sunny Side Up single version of I Know That with just the Sonny Rollins solo in the head.
Yeah, the head, exactly. Yeah. Oh, I'm here for that. I
don't know.
That'd be cool. You could play it on the radio. Well, no, people these days don't know what music is. But all right, let's get into our overall album thoughts and ratings. I'll go first this week. So my overall album thoughts: Rollins and Stitt combined forces with the bop trumpet legend Dizzy Gillespie to make a hard-hitting and energetic 4-track album. That the energy that Stitt and Rollins have playing together and playing off of one another is so intense that it really brings out the best of each of them musically. There are some all-time solos from each of them that take place on the album, such as Stitt's solo on Eternal Light and Rollins' incredible playing over the rhythm section hits on I Know That. This recording of the standard On the Sunny Side of the Street is one of the most prolific recordings of the tune in the jazz catalog, and it's only fitting that it's on the album entitled Sunny Side Up. I also think that the rhythm section is swinging hard and does a great job of keeping up with the high intensity set forth by the 2 saxophones. There is a little bit of a lack of clarity in certain moments from the rhythm section, but it's not anything that doesn't resolve extremely quickly. And then one other thing I think is that there are times, I talked about this, when there's some talking in the studio that bleeds into the mix, which can be good in certain moments when you want it, but also sometimes can be distracting. My last kind of semi-criticism of the album, one thing I really wish that they had figured out a way to do a ballad on the album, as though I feel with the energy that they set forth, it might have been just super killer to be able to have the ballad edition, and feels like maybe the only thing that the album is lacking is just a powerhouse ballad with these guys on it. So, but all in all, and I want to shout out Dizzy Gillespie. He kind of is in the shadows on this one, but he's kind of a father of jazz and brought so many musicians into his band and things. So it just feels like he's playing his role super well, and he doesn't need to. He can let these guys shine on the album. So there's a shout out to Dizzy there as well. And it's just an incredible display of musicianship and the use of the jazz language as a whole. And it should be regarded as such. This album is short and it's sweet, but it allows for the musicians to really stretch their legs and let their playing shine, which I appreciate. This is definitely a crash course of the 2 Sonnys of the saxophone world. And for that reason, I give it an 8.8 out of 10. There are just those few things that detract from bringing this below the 9 out of 10, in my opinion, but the playing on it is in the excellent range. It's just a few things that, about the recording that a couple points get taken off for. Max, what did you think overall about the album?
I think this album speaks to the supreme musicality of Sonny Rollins, Sonny Stitt, and Dizzy. You're right, the 2 Sonnys kind of shine out a lot more from the tracks, but Dizzy does his role well. I think a lot of the arranging of the intros and outros probably comes from him, and so his presence on the album is very evident. The rhythm section interacts nicely throughout, and it's all in all a very hard-driving, very swinging album that should be listened to by those that are really into the jazz tradition. This version of Sunny Side of the Street is timeless and well known because of the vocal feature of Dizzy, and it also has some really neat arranging. Obviously, the other standout is Stitt's original Eternal Triangle, with Stitt's elongated burnin' 8-chorus solo, in addition to some classic tenor sax battling and trading with Sonny Rollins. I think this album showcases the blues really well too, with the track After Hours, and also the underplayed Humans classic I Know That You Know. It's I'm glad that they did that tune. I'm glad they did a Vincent Humans tune, and the way they play on it is pretty superb, especially Sonny Rollins's solo with just rhythm section hits. It's absolutely killer. I think because of all those tunes and their interesting arrangements and features, there are moments on here that I would call otherworldly. Just some of the things that Stitt and Rollins and even Bryant and Dizzy do at certain moments are just so musically amazing that I am constantly not only entertained but challenged or influenced by something that these players do at different points in their solos. Each time I listen, I get something new from something that they're doing, and so that's just simply amazing. And that means it's a really good record. Um, so because of those terrific solos, the differences in the improvisatory approach you can hear from the two Sonnies, as well as Dizzy's prominent sound and fast moving lines, there's just a lot to listen for with this record. Some consider it a jam session recording, but to me, that term neglects the amount of thought that seemingly went into the arranging of the tunes and the way in which the different solos on the recording are treated by the rhythm section. To me, it is not a jam session. It is a recording where jazz musicians are allowed to be jazz musicians. They are allowed to stretch, they're allowed to develop, and here they get a chance to do what they ultimately are able to do and can showcase not only their talents and their musical abilities, but they give so much to the language of jazz with this album. And it's all in all a great record to me. I think Sunny Side Up should be forever regarded as something unique and something special. My overall score was a 9 out of 10.
Yeah, and I think you make a lot of great points there, and I think that rating is right on point, and so that brings our overall rating to an 8.9 out of 10 for this album. Definitely an album you have to check out. It's not that long. I think it's 37 minutes in total. Some of the tracks are longer, but this is one that I highly, highly recommend listening to, especially if you haven't listened to much Sonny Rollins or Sonny Stitt. Check this out. It's just, like I said, it's a crash course into these two guys, and it's really something to listen to. But let's go, before we get into our episode for next week, I want to just go over a few housekeeping things. We now have an Instagram, the Jazz Jam Podcast. Make sure to follow us there. If you want to reach out to us to submit a listener question, or if you have an album recommendation, our email is thejazzjampodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you there, or you can DM us on Instagram. Either way, we also have a Spotify playlist with all of our top 3 tracks from every album that we've done, every episode that we've done. So if you just want to you don't want to maybe listen to entire albums, but you kind of want to get the gist of what we're listening to and what we like, that's a good place to go. That'll be linked in the show notes below. And that's pretty much it for our housekeeping stuff. Now we'll get into our episode for next week. Next week we have a new album by the Blue Note saxophone player Emmanuel Wilkins. It's his most recent album. It came out earlier this year. It's entitled The Seventh Wonder. And I think we're doing a really good job of kind of getting into different types of newer jazz music. We definitely have hit on some different things with some African jazz music, some more funk and groove style stuff. And this one definitely has a different feel to it. Maybe more of a lighter pop approach. I don't want to say pop necessarily, but it definitely has a different feel to it than a straight ahead or like maybe a funk or an African jazz influenced album. So yeah, excited to get into this one. I haven't listened to this whole album. I've listened to some of the stuff off of it. So yeah, excited to see what Emmanuel has going on here. Max, any thoughts to close us out?
No, I just really have been enjoying what we're doing. I really want people to treat this as something, where you can you can treat it how you want to treat it. If you want to listen to the album and then listen to us back and forth in between songs or in between solos or at the same time or one after the other, I think that's a great way to do it. I just appreciate anyone who's listening, anyone who's engaging with us. We want to keep going and keep doing this. So feel free to let us know how we're doing at the Jazz Jam Podcast at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Any thoughts, recommendations, any disagreements with us? Maybe you really agree with us, or something, or you have a story that you're reminded of from what we're talking about, or if you have questions about gigging, about music, or about jazz history, feel free to reach out to us. There's so many albums to go over. I don't think we can go over every single album unless we do this for hundreds and hundreds of years.
maybe we will, Max. But
maybe.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you say there. And I just want to say there's so many ways to consume what we're doing. If you don't want to listen to the whole episode, we're going to start making it so we'll put the timestamps in there. So if you just want to hear our thoughts, you can also go to our website and just read our overall thoughts and our reviews, our ratings. If you just would like to do that, obviously some people are going to want to hear everything we have to say and really take a deep dive into what we're doing. But yeah, any way that you want to consume it is great. We're just glad that we can share our love of jazz music with you, whether it be just listening to our Spotify playlist, checking out our website, listening to certain parts, just listening to the albums that we're listening to. I just really appreciate it, and yeah, we'd love to interact with you. So feel free to anything you have, questions, anything, reach out to us on Instagram or at on our email address. And so yeah, that's gonna close us out for this album. I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I'm so glad that Max brought this one up. I needed to listen to this album. So for Max Levy, I'm Dwayne Gunnels, and this has been an episode of the Jazz Jam Podcast.